This is a New England Nun screencast part two, just some text notes. We're kind of working our way through. And so we kind of left off when we were talking about how they both kind of changed, how she'd become more independent in his absence and had kind of fallen into the life that she was leading now, and that there was a really room for him in that life. And we can see that through her actions. And he knows that too. Like he's aware that he doesn't quite fit in. It says he always feels like he's in surrounded by a hedge of lace and he's afraid to put his foot and he's uncomfortable in her home, and so we see that they've grown apart, but it wasn't always that way. We talked about 15 years ago she thought she had loved him. She had accepted him with no hesitation, and he had, didn't want to leave her, but he knew that he needed to make a fortune and he was going to do that whatever it took. And but time had kind of gotten in the way, and it had kind of uh, changed both of them in different ways. And so it makes a point of talking about how that she had been faithful to him. She'd never once dreamed of the possibility of marrying anyone else. This is not about someone else or her wanting to be with someone else. I think that needs to be kind of really clear. She didn't fall out of love with him. It was more likely that she never really loved him fully in the first place. And then time kind of helped solidify that. But she'd been faithful. She hadn't thought about marrying anybody else. It said her life, especially for the last 7 years, had been full of pleasant peace. She had never felt discontented nor impatient over her lover's absence. But she had still looked forward to his return. But the difference is that she had fallen in to a way of placing it so far into the future that it was almost equal to placing it over the boundaries of another life. As more and more time passed, she kept pushing back the idea of him returning and then their life being together. And so now, 14 years, 15 years later, it's almost like it's a different life that somebody else is living. It's not her life. Um, it says when Joe came, she had been expecting him and expecting to be married for 14 years, but she was as much surprised and taken aback as if she'd never thought of it. So when he finally did come home with the intention of marriage, she's surprised and taken aback that it's actually really happened. It's happening. It's going to happen. We're going to be together. And then it goes on to talk about to her to for them actually to be together, it would change everything about her life. It's that Joe had made some extensive and quite magnificent alterations in his house. It was the old homestead. The newly married couple would live there, for Joe could not desert his mother, who refused to leave her old home, so Louisa must leave hers. So first things first, she has to leave the home that she's built for herself, this comfortable, ordered, solitary life, to live with him in his house with his mother. Um, and so it says every morning rising and going among her neat maidenly possessions, she felt as one looking her last upon the faces of dear friends. It was true that in a measure she could take them with her, but rubbed at their old environments, they would appear in such new guises that they would almost cease to be themselves. So she could take these things with her, but it would no longer be the same for her. Um, then she thinks about the fact that she would have a large house to take care of, and she would have to entertain company, and then she would have to deal with Joe and his feeble old mother, and she'd have to have a servant, and she would have to give up all of the pleasant parts of life that she had developed in her solitude. And she liked to sit and distill herbs and aromatics, essences. She's a, what is that? Young Living. She's a Young Living oil person before it was a thing, huh? Um, and that, all of that is very disconcerting to her, um, because her life would change so much, and she's found that she doesn't really want to change um, the way that she lives her life, especially the fact that she would have to kind of give up the pleasures that she has in her life and how much she loved to sew and distill her essences. But Joe, her domineering, shrewd old matron mother-in-law, and Joe himself, with his honest masculine rudeness, would laugh and frown down all her old maiden ways. She would also have to give up the dog that she keeps, possibly the bird. So she would be the one making kind of all of the changing here, and he would continue to live his life the way that he had kind of always lived it. And so that didn't really sit right with her, but she was determined to do it. She was determined to do it. Um, that you know, it said it was not for her, whatever came to pass, to prove untrue and break his heart. So she finishes up her wedding garments, and it comes down to about a week before the wedding day, and she's outside taking a stroll about 9 o'clock at night, and she's walking along the way, and she hears two people chatting. She hears footsteps and low voices, and she knows that they're sitting upon the stone wall, and it turns out that it is Joe and Lily sitting there talking beside the path, and they're passionately talking about their feelings. Joe says, well, you've made up your mind then, I suppose. And Lily says, yes, I'm going a day after tomorrow. And he says, well, I ain't got a word to say. I don't know what you could say. Not a word to say. I ain't sorry that that happened yesterday, that we kind of let on how we felt to each other. I guess it's just as well we knew. Of course, I can't do anything different. I'm going right on and get married next week. I ain't going back on a woman that's waited for me 14 years and break her heart. If you should jilt her tomorrow, I wouldn't have you. Well, I ain't going to give you the chance, but I don't believe you would either. You see, I wouldn't. Honor's honor, and right's right. And I'd never think of anything of any man that went against him for me or any other girl. You find that out, Joe Daggett. Well, you find out fast enough that I ain't going against him for you or any other girl. And so we see this conversation, this passionate conversation they're having. Apparently, they let on about their feelings for each other. Not anything dishonest. I don't think there was any, kind of fooling around or anything like that. I think it just kind of came to a head all these years that, I think Lily kind of always been a person that got him. They even talk alike. And I think that that's something that she does, that Freeman does a really good job of showing here. They even sound like each other. They use the same kind of local color dialect, and that's another stark contradiction that he has that is not the same as what he has with Louisa. And she's a pretty girl. Lily Dyer is a pretty girl. She's um, uh, you know. She's good and handsome and smart, and people say nice things about her. And this isn't just some you know saucy woman that that's turned his eye. This is a steady, constant woman figure in his life that takes care of his mother and his mother relies on. And this is something that's been kind of blooming for a long time, but both of them know that those feelings are wrong, regardless of how they feel, and they're not going to go back on the promises that they made. Joe's not going to give her up. It says um no, Joe Daggett, I'll never marry another man as long as I live. I've got good sense, and I ain't going to break my heart nor make a fool of myself, but I'm never going to be married, you can be sure of that. I ain't the sort of girl to feel this way twice. Louisa heard an exclamation and a soft commotion behind the bushes, and Lily spoke again. The voice sounded as if she had risen. This must be a put a stop to. We've stayed here long enough. I'm going home. Um, it's definitely something that they both feel very passionately about. They both care about each other. And and Louisa hears this, all this taking place. Um, And at first, she's kind of in a daze. She gets up the next day, she does her housework, um, and she thinks about everything. Um, she sees kind of, you know, a way out, um, but she's kind of afraid to do it. So she breaks off their engagement. And she says that she had lived so long in one way that she shrank from making a change. She never mentions Lily or the fact that she overheard their conversation. Joe takes it really well. He says that, he would have done right by her until the very end if they had stayed together, and she says, I know you would have. And, that evening, she weeps about it a little bit. But the next morning, she wakes up and she feels like a queen. um, Her whole perspective on life is kind of changed now that she's gotten that attachment. She's free from that attachment, and she thinks about the days that are coming, and all the days that she's going to have sitting with her needlework and taking care of her home. And uh, Lily passes by the house and it doesn't even give her any pause. She feels so happy and serene with her decision. It said, she gazed ahead through a long reach of future days strung together like pearls in a rosary, every one like the others, and all smooth and flawless and innocent, and her heart went up in thankfulness. She's thankful that it had come to this because she knew that this was what her heart really wanted. And we see her there sitting at her sewing, peacefully, prayerfully numbering her days like an uncloistered nun. That gives me so much, Mrs. Mallard, Louise, which is very strange that her name is Louise Mallard and this is Louisa. That she carries herself like a goddess of victory, and she's thinking about all the days that would belong to her. And so we definitely get those vibes here at the end of A New England Nun. Um, I think that that Freeman does a great job of going through those inner feelings and those inner emotions, and that's all part of that realism that we talked about when we started this unit. We see those interior workings of the mind, um, and and that simple day-to-day routine. We talked about that quotidian life, that seemingly boring, normal everyday life. But for Louisa, it's her whole entire world, and it's what she's chosen for herself, and she takes so much pride in those domestic things. And I think this is just a really good example of realism here, where usually we see women kind of fighting in our stories. We see them fighting against that whole idea of being in the kitchen, at the home, doing the housework. But here, Freeman kind of turns all that on its head, and she seeks out that life for herself, and that's how that story ends.